There are questions that politicians avoid, journalists change the subject, and experts start talking faster. Here's one of them. What if America stops being the world's policeman? What if it focuses on itself, on its own borders, its own economy, its own people, and lets the rest of the world solve its problems on its own? Most people in the corridors of power in Washington think that this question is heretical, a question for heretics. They will tell you it's irresponsible, it's dangerous, it's a betrayal of allies. It's the end of American leadership, although in my opinion they are substituting the concept of leadership with some other concept, this concept. And here's another question. What if they are wrong? What if 70 years of global interventions, trillions of dollars in military spending, thousands of American soldiers killed in wars for someone else's interests? What if all of this wasn't about defending America, but about gradually draining it? Today we ask this question honestly, without political correctness, using the tools of the science of liberty, the intellectual foundation given to us by Adam Smith, Mises, Hayek, Bastiat, and Galambasi. Because the real question should be, what is best for America? America. So, a brief history of American global intervention. Let's start with the facts, because facts are where any science begins. The United States is founded on a principle that was formulated by John Quincy Adams in 1821. He said, America does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. She wishes freedom and independence for all, but she will defend only her own freedom. This was the American doctrine for 100 years, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. The Western Hemisphere is our area of responsibility. The rest of the world is not ours. What has changed? World War I, World War II, they caused so much trouble there. Everything started from Europe and spread all over the world. And then the Cold War, which turned America from a republic into an empire. Look at the numbers. Since 1945, look, to this day, the U.S. has conducted military operations in more than 70 countries. 70. Korea, Vietnam, Cambodia, Grenada, Panama, Iraq twice, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Somalia, Yemen. This is not a complete list. And the results are brilliant. Korea is a divided peninsula. The threat of nuclear war remains to this day. Vietnam, an American defeat. 58,000 soldiers killed. Vietnam, as they say, ended up back where it started, but at what cost? The country still became communist in those times anyway. Iraq, chaos, ISIS, Iranian influence. Afghanistan, 20 years of war. $2 trillion, and the Taliban returned the very next day after the American troops left. That doesn't mean all these wars were pointless. Some of them were necessary, but the pattern is obvious. Military operations. American intervention by itself doesn't create freedom. It creates dependence, instability, and backlash. Bastiev would say, don't just look at what is visible, look at what is invisible. What is visible is Saddam's destroyed regime. What is invisible is the power vacuum filled by even worse forces. So that's what America's real interest is, right? Before answering the question of what to do, we need to answer another. What exactly is the American interest in the first place? Not what politicians say, not what newspapers write, but the real, measurable, concrete interest of an American citizen. Well, the first thing, of course, is the security of the homeland. An American wants to live without fear of invasion, terrorism, or a nuclear strike. That's fundamental. Well, what do we call that in the study of beings with free will? Life and bodily integrity are what's called primary property. The second is economic prosperity. An American wants a job, wants increasing income, wants cheap goods, wants open markets. Adam Smith explained this 250 years ago. Trade creates wealth, war destroys it. There you go. And third is freedom. No, the third will be followed by a fourth. The right to live by your own rules, to spend what you've earned, not to ask the government for permission for every step in life. The fourth, and this is crucial, a stable world order in which trade is possible. Not democracy in every country, not human rights in Somalia, but simply open sea routes, functioning financial systems, and predictable rules of the game. That's it, 4 points. Everything else is ideology, 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 not interest. Now let's look at each of them through the lens of the question, how can they best be achieved? Through global intervention, or let's call it strategic realism. The United States of America is the only, you probably just thought, yes, probably, the only country in the world with an ocean on each side. Friendliness, friendly neighbors to the north and south. They can say whatever they want, but they are friendly, and they have a nuclear arsenal capable of destroying any aggressor. From the point of view of physical geography, this is an ideal strategic position. Neither Russia nor China nor Iran are capable of invading American territory. The only real threat is nuclear weapons and terrorism. Neither of these threats is eliminated by sending soldiers to Afghanistan or Iraq. They are addressed through intelligence, diplomacy, and nuclear deterrence. For the territorial security of the United States, it is not necessary to keep troops in 70 countries. Let's talk about the economy. So the American economy is the largest in the world, with a GDP of $25 trillion. Well, it's somewhere between 24 and 26. It fluctuates all the time, so to speak. But it depends on global trade, on access to resources, on open sea routes. The Strait of Hormuz, the Strait of Malacca, the Suez Canal, these are all points through which most of global trade passes. Their blockade is a blow to the American economy. Why? Because we are a quarter of the world economy. Even if the U.S. itself is no longer dependent on Middle Eastern oil thanks to the shale revolution, we used to be dependent. But here is the key question. Is it necessary to keep aircraft carriers in the Persian Gulf all the time? Or is it enough to have the ability to quickly send them there if needed? Mises would answer, a constant presence creates an illusion of security, but generates real commitments and real expenses. And those expenses have to be earned beforehand. That is, there has to be income, and instead of spending it on something else, you spend it on this. The market finds more efficient solutions, for example, insurance, risk creation. Diversification of routes, we'll talk about this a bit later. Development of alternative energy sources. Now, freedom. Probably the most painful point, because it was precisely in the name of spreading freedom that the most costly and failed American interventions were launched. Ayn Rand would say clearly, freedom cannot be imposed from the outside. Freedom can only grow from within, from culture, from traditions, from economic development. American soldiers cannot bring freedom to a country that historically has no traditions of individual rights. What will they do with this freedom? It's simply terrifying. Afghanistan, 20 years, $2 trillion. The result is zero. Because the problem wasn't the lack of money or military power. There was money. There was military power. The problem was that Afghan society didn't want the American model of freedom. That's their right. It's absolutely their right. Yes. 4 schools of thought.
Значит, относительно
On the issues I told you about, each has its own arguments, each has blind spots. Let's figure it out honestly. The first school of thought, the first line of thinking, global leadership. Consensus from 1945 until around 2016 up to Trump. The essence is simple. America is the indispensable nation. The world order relies on American power, on the fist called America. Protect the USA and the world? I'm not sure. It might not fall apart, but chaos could follow. The arguments are strong. After World War II, it was precisely the American presence that prevented Soviet expansion into Western Europe. It was the American nuclear umbrella that gave Japan and Germany the opportunity to recover without military expenses and become economic giants. It was the American Navy that ensured the freedom of maritime trade. But this school of thought has a fundamental flaw. It doesn't have an exit mechanism. So how do you get out of it? Once you take on the role of the world's policeman, it's almost impossible to step out of it. Any step back is interpreted as weakness, as an invitation for aggressors. The result is endless. Endless increase, escalation of commitments and expenses. Yes, expenses. And they all fall on the shoulders of the same people called American taxpayers. And half of our country doesn't even pay taxes. Anyway, thank you very much. Hayek warned about the same thing in a different context. Bureaucracy never shrinks on its own. The military-industrial complex is the same bureaucracy, just in uniform. As Sarah Palin once said, "What's the difference, soccer mom? I mean, so to speak there, mom."
Mama,
the mother of an American child who rushes to protect him and so on from a bulldog. She said, only by one thing, lipstick. The second kind of school of thought, the direction of thought, is neo-isolationism. This is a position that is often associated with Trump today, although the roots, of course, go back to Charles Lindbergh. There was such a movement in the 1930s called America First. We withdraw from everywhere. We close the borders, build a wall, and focus on internal problems. America First. That's not really what Trump is saying, but his opponents easily lump it all together. The appeal is obvious. After 20 years of wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, after $3 trillion wasted, after thousands of deaths with no visible result, it's real and justified. But isolationism has a historical rebuttal that's hard to ignore. In the 1930s, America looked at what was happening in Europe and said, "This is not our problem." And the result was Pearl Harbor. The world came to those who were hiding from it. Columbus would have understood the irony. The attempt to protect yourself through isolation creates exactly the threat you're trying to prevent. A power vacuum. It's an invitation for trouble for those who don't share your values. The third school is liberal internationalism. There was the communist one, there was the socialist one, and this one is liberal. This is the position of Clinton, Obama, and most of the Democratic Party. The essence is to spread democracy, human rights, and international institutions. The UN, IMF, World Bank, and International Criminal Court are all tools for creating a world order based on rules. That is, rules coming from a single point, from a single mind, from a single power. Theoretically, it sounds nice. The practical gap between declarations and reality is absolutely enormous. The UN was blocked by Russian and Chinese vetoes. The IMF imposes programs that destroy the economies of developing countries. The International Criminal Court prosecutes African leaders, but not American generals, or suddenly tries to prosecute the Israeli Prime Minister. Bastian would call this a law that is applied incredibly selectively, which means it's no longer a law but just a tool of power. And the fourth school is strategic realism, the position advocated by, let's say, Kissinger, Kennan, Mearsheimer. The essence is that states have no permanent friends, only permanent interests. Moral declarations are politics. Real politics is the balance of power. Realists would say, it doesn't matter whether there is democracy in Saudi Arabia or not. What matters is that it ensures stability in oil markets. It doesn't matter whether China respects human rights. What matters is that it wouldn't dominate the Pacific region. This school of thought has a cynicism that irritates moralists, but it has one advantage: it works. It was precisely the realist policy of Nixon and Kissinger that opened up China. It was precisely Kennan's realist containment that kept the USSR in check without a single shot being fired. But today, ladies and gentlemen, we need to understand that America has only one, if not an enemy, then a rival and potentially an outright enemy. That's why China is the only real challenge to us, and that's the main thing. If we put ideology aside and look at the facts, there is only one power capable of posing a systemic challenge to the Americans. It's not Russia, not Iran, and not even North Korea. It's China. Why not Russia? Because Russia is a declining power with an economy the size of Italy's, and it spends 40% of its state budget on war. Russia acted locally, for Ukraine, for the Baltics, for Georgia, globally, no. China is on a completely different scale, 1.5 billion people. The world's second largest economy, which has already surpassed the American one in terms of purchasing power parity. The largest manufacturer in the world, a monopoly on rare earth metals without which modern electronics are impossible, a rapidly growing navy, and the ambitions of a global power backed by real resources. Beijing is implementing a strategy that could be called
медленное поглощение.
not a military invasion, but economic penetration. That's what they call the Belt and Road. The Belt is not charity. It's strategic investment in the infrastructure of 60 countries with the goal of creating dependence. Ports, roads, power plants, and debt traps for governments that can't pay back. Africa is a critical example. China controls cobalt mining in Congo, lithium in Zambia, and rare earth metals across the continent. Without these metals, there are no electric vehicles, no military electronics, no semiconductors. American technological civilization depends on supply chains controlled by whom? Beijing. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's geoeconomics, and Washington missed it. For 20 years it was asleep, dealing with Iraq and Afghanistan. Taiwan isn't just a disputed territory. Taiwan produces 90% of the advanced chips that power the entire global economy. If China were to seize Taiwan, it would mean technological capitulation for the United States. This is a matter of national security in the most direct sense. Conclusion. Focusing on China is not isolationism, it's about setting priorities. Everything else, Europe, the Middle East, Africa, should be evaluated through one question. How does this affect the competition with China? Let's talk about Europe. Who are they to us? Fellow travelers? Allies, or maybe opponents? After all, they're heading to the place you and I ran from. Why should we protect them? We crossed borders, lost our possessions, lost our languages, and lost our professions for one thing, for freedom. And now today I look at Europe and I have a question that I can't help but ask out loud, publicly, honestly. Europe is moving in the direction we fled from, slowly, elegantly, with good manners and beautiful words, but in that direction. So who are they to us? Fellow travelers or opponents? And why should the American taxpayer pay to defend a system that is building what we ran away from? I don't want to be unfair. Europe is certainly not the USSR. It's important to say that right away. No one there is sitting in the gulag for telling a joke, but you can get fined for a joke, and you can even end up in jail. No one has been shot for dissent, and that's different. The time hasn't come. They'll start shooting too. Let's examine the facts realistically. In Germany, there is Section 130 of the Criminal Code, incitement to hatred. Sounds reasonable, right? In practice, people are prosecuted under it for Facebook posts about migration policy, not for calls to violence. The opinion that the government is behaving incorrectly towards, in the UK, people are arrested for tweets. Literally, a person wrote something on the internet and the police showed up. The European Digital Services Act obliges platforms to remove harmful content. I remember when I was told that harmful content had to be removed from the script. That was in 1969 in the city of Leningrad. Leningrad was in the USSR. And here there are threats of fines worth billions of euros. But who decides what is harmful and what isn't? Bureaucrats in Brussels, the smartest ones. Not a court, not the people, but bureaucrats. Even if it were a court, for me it would be the same thing. We've already seen this, we've already been through this, only back then it was called anti-Soviet agitation or propaganda. The European Central Bank is developing a digital euro. Officially it's for convenience, but in practice it's complete control over every transaction of every citizen. This is exactly what's happening now in China. The government will know what you bought, when, where, for how much, and from whom. The government will be able to freeze your account, limit your purchases, and set an expiration date for your money. You earned it, but if you don't spend it by the end of the month, it expires. You can't spend it more than 51 kilometers from your home and things like that. This isn't a conspiracy theory, it's the official policy of the ECB. Read their own documents, it's all written there. It's written in black and white, blue on white, yellow on brown. I don't know. It's written there. In the USSR, this was called a planned economy. The money belonged to the state. You were just using it as long as the state allowed. In Hungary, there are democratic elections. Most Hungarians vote for Orbán again and again. It's their choice. They don't like what Brussels is offering, and the EU's response is to freeze billions of euros in funding. Why? Because Hungary voted for someone they didn't want Hungary to vote for. What do you call that, guys? This is coercion of a modern sovereign nation, forcing a nation to change its opinion under financial pressure. There you go. Well, what was it called in the USSR? The leading role of the party. The party knows best. The people must follow the party line. If they don't, there will be consequences. European small businesses are simply buried under thousands of directives, standards, environmental requirements, and labor regulations. In France, I found out, firing an employee is a months-long legal battle. In Italy, opening a restaurant means years of working on permits. As a result, the European economy is stagnating. Innovations are moving to the US or Asia, young Europeans are leaving, and the demographic problem is getting worse. This isn't capitalism, it's government control over the economy. This is regulation instead of, well, it's like nationalization, regulation instead of freedom. Different tools, same result. So, regulation or nationalization. One was communism, the other fascism. Fascism. Fascism is exactly the regulation of business. A person is not free in their economic decisions. Well, some might say that Europe is still freer than Russia. Absolutely right. No one argues with that. There are no political prisoners in Europe on the scale of Putin's Russia, but they do exist. There are, but there are fewer of them, proportionally fewer. That is, there is less of a war against their own people. But that's just comparing yourself to the worst. I'm better than the worst. That's not a criterion for freedom. That's just a minimal bar. Europe is moving toward greater government control. That's a fact. The pace is slow, but the direction is obvious. Polish worker, German engineer, entrepreneur. Of course, they didn't build the digital euro. They didn't adopt the DSA directive either. They live their lives, raise children, work. They are people just like you and me. But here's the question. Why do they vote for the parties that do all this? Why isn't there massive resistance? The answer is simple. Because most Europeans have chosen security over freedom. Not under coercion, voluntarily. The state says, I'll provide you with health care, a pension, benefits, unemployment support, subsidized housing. In return, give me some of your decision-making, some of your choices. And the majority, like a herd, rushes and raises their hand in favor. This isn't the Soviet system, it's a voluntary contract. People who are used to state care lose the ability to live without it. Yes, of course, Russian occupation. This isn't the digital euro and it's not paragraph 130. This is the FSB, this is political assassinations, this is confiscation of property, the destruction of civil society. We know this. We or our parents have seen this. In my case, it's me. For someone else, maybe their parents. That's a real argument. I accept it. But it doesn't answer the question about principles. It answers the question about the lesser evil, that for now there is less evil in Europe. Now we reach the hardest part. The politics of the lesser evil is a trap that everyone falls into. There will always be something worse to compare what's in front of you to, and every time we choose the lesser evil, we normalize that lesser evil. In the real world, the choice is not between perfect freedom and lack of freedom. The choice is between imperfect freedom and its complete absence. There are no degrees of freedom. Either you have it or you don't. Either you are a slave or you are a free person. And here I will say something that may sound paradoxical. After everything I just said, nevertheless, Europe is worth defending. Not because it is perfect, not because it is moving in some direction that we consider right, because the alternative, Europe under Russian or Chinese, let's call it, influence, yes, that would be the end of any possibility of moving toward greater freedom there. Imperfect freedom has a chance to be corrected. Occupation does not. Free exchange only works when both sides benefit. One-sided deals are not a market. They're coercion or charity. The American taxpayer is not obligated to subsidize the European welfare state. He is not obligated to pay pensions for the French. By the way, they retire at 60 while we work until 60 just to provide them with pensions. He is not obligated to keep troops on German bases while Germany spends. How much do they spend again? 1% of GDP or 1.5, 1.2, I don't remember exactly. And they spend 2% on subsidies for their companies so they can sell goods to us cheaper to compete with us and push us out of the market. The terms of the contract must be simple and transparent. There are two conditions under which Europe is worth protecting. The first is pragmatic. Europe under Russian or Chinese control is dangerous for American interests. This is geopolitics. This isn't about idealism, it's about interest. As long as this condition is met, it's worth defending. But only on the condition of a real contract, not a one-sided subsidy. And the second fundamental point, Europe must remain a space where movement toward greater freedom is possible. Not perfect, not American, but movement in that direction, not the other way around. If it moves backward, we need to say it directly, like friends tell a friend who is making a mistake. If they continue, then reconsider the position. And to defend, yes, it's not unconditional, not free, as they say, and not silently. The second aspect we need to think about is the Middle East. Here, the American strategy has failed. It has failed most obviously. And here, a change of course is the most dangerous. Despite the fact that Russia was kicked out of Syria, despite the fact that a bunch of Sunni states have now signed agreements with us, signed the Abraham Accords, and so on and so forth. A change of course, nevertheless, is necessary. In general, why did the U.S. get involved and stay in the Middle East? Historically, it was oil. Oil for the American economy, oil for the Allies. That was a real interest. But the shale revolution changed all that. The United States became the largest producer of oil and gas in the world. Dependence on Middle Eastern oil is close to zero. The number one strategic reason for being in the region has disappeared. Two reasons remain. The first, and I say this not as a Jew, but as, so to speak, an American taking a sober, big-picture view, Israel. It's the only real democracy in the region, a strategic ally, an intelligence partner. And supporting Israel is not altruism, it's a direct American interest. Second, it's the Iranian nuclear program. A nuclear Iran changes the balance of power throughout the Middle East, provoking a nuclear arms race. Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey will immediately start developing their own, creating a real threat to American allies. Everything else, regime change, democratization, are failed projects. They cost trillions but gave nothing, zero, or as they say in Israel, Efes. The current war with Iran fits into this logic. Destroying Iran's nuclear program is a real interest, but a prolonged occupation, an attempt to build a new Iran, is a repeat of the Iraq scenario. To strike and leave is strategically correct. To stay would be strategic suicide. Well, all right. So let's also take a look at Africa and Latin America. So, Africa is a continent. I know it's of less interest to you, but still, just for the overall picture. Africa is the continent of the future, of course. Not because good people live there, although that's quite possible, but because it has the resources for the next technological cycle. Cobalt for batteries, lithium for electric cars, rare earth metals for semiconductors, uranium for nuclear power plants. All of this is in Africa, and all of this is under China's control. That's right, American policy in Africa is not military. It's competition with China for economic influence, investments, trade agreements, and technological partnership. Not imposing democracy, not military bases, but honest economic exchange. what Adam Smith called mutually beneficial trade. Latin America is America's own backyard, its own plot of land.
Значит,
His Monroe Doctrine was right at its core. The Western Hemisphere is a zone of American interests, not because Latin Americans are worse or better than others, but because instability nearby affects American security and trade. Migration, is not exactly what we need. The problem is not the lack of military presence in Latin America. The problem is that American policy there has either been military coups supporting dictators convenient for us, or complete neglect. Neither of those worked. What works are trade, investment, and fighting drug cartels that destabilize the entire region. Now let's approach the issue from another angle. Not from the perspective of geopolitics, but from the perspective of principles. Galampus defined freedom as the state of a person in which his primary and secondary property is protected from coercion. Primary property is life, secondary is everything produced from it. That includes time, money, and day. From this point of view, a state that takes money from the taxpayer through coercion and spends it on wars abroad, by the way, absolutely without the taxpayer's consent, violates his freedom. Every American soldier who dies in a war for someone else's interests is a violation of primary property. That doesn't mean an army isn't needed. In a world where coercion exists, protection from coercion is necessary. The army is a tool for protection, but the key word is protection, not expansion, not what they call nation building, and by no means democratization. Voluntary cooperation and trade produce better results than central planning. This is true not only for the economy, but also for international relations. Trying to plan from Washington what Iraq or Afghanistan should look like is the same mistake as trying to plan the Soviet economy from Moscow. Adam Smith said in The Wealth of Nations, "Trade between nations creates interdependence, which makes war economically disadvantageous, possible but economically disadvantageous. The most reliable path to peace is not military alliances but the market. Countries that trade with each other usually don't go to war because war destroys mutual benefit. But for trade, you need order, functioning sea routes, predictable rules, and property protection. Someone has to provide this order. Historically, it was Britain, then America. If the U.S. leaves, who's next? China? This isn't a rhetorical question, it's a real one. Let's talk about NATO separately because right now that's the most pressing issue. Trump called NATO a paper tiger. He's partly right. An alliance where one country pays 70% of the expenses and more than 20 countries get protection almost for free is not a very fair deal. Trump is right when he says, this needs to change. But leaving NATO is not a reform. It's the destruction of a tool that has worked for 70 years. Let's look at the fact. Since 1949, there hasn't been a single war between NATO members. Not one. The alliance prevented Soviet expansion in Europe without a single shot fired between the great powers. This is a colossal achievement. It's often overlooked precisely because it didn't happen. The right approach is a conditional, reformed, and fairer structure. Every country pays its share. Every country takes on real commitments. The U.S. maintains its nuclear umbrella but stops subsidizing European socialism. This isn't weakness, it's simply smarter power. Power that tells allies, we're with you but on reciprocal terms, a contract, not charity. Let's discuss something rarely mentioned in foreign policy, America's internal affairs. While Washington debates whether to defend Europe or the Middle East, things are happening inside the United States itself that should worry anyone who values freedom. The national debt is $38 trillion, right? This isn't an abstraction, it's the debt of every American. That's $100,000 for every man, woman, and child in the country. The interest payments on this debt already exceed our military budget. The Book of American Regulations is over 80,000 pages long. Each page is a restriction on the freedom of entrepreneurs, a cost for business, a barrier to innovation. Small business, the backbone of the American economy, is drowning in paperwork, licenses, and what is called compliance. Now, inflation from 2020 to 2024, and the purchasing power of the dollar has dropped, well, give or take, by about 20%. This is not a coincidence. This is the result of policy. The government prints money to finance wars and social programs. Inflation is a hidden tax on all dollar holders. Well, they impose this tax in order to wage wars. Well, or just to steal blatantly. Censorship and political correctness, freedom of speech, the First Amendment. That's what makes America unique in the world. Well, today there's self-censorship in universities, corporate cancel culture, pressure on dissenters. These aren't Soviet methods yet, but they have a similar effect. People are afraid to speak the truth. Golambus warned, freedom is not a given, it's the result of constant defense. When society stops defending it, it disappears, quietly, gradually. Through regulations, taxes, social pressure, not through revolution, through the evolution of the state apparatus. We're not where Europe is yet, but we've already started to stumble too. The most important front for America is not Europe, not the Middle East, not China. The most important front is inside the country. It's a return to the principles of the Founding Fathers: limited government, free markets, individual rights, and the rule of law. But our ally is Europe. It's not our partner in defending freedom. This is our shared freedom against tyranny. Yesterday, we and they were on the same wavelength. But today, who are they today? Europe is losing its freedom not through military defeat, but gradually, voluntarily, through its own institutions. Regulation instead of the marketplace, security instead of freedom, collective decisions instead of individual rights. Hayek described this process in 1944 and called it the road to serfdom. By the way, I have this book on my shelf. It's one of the most important ones I own. Europe is going down that road slowly but surely. We have looked at history, theory, geopolitics, and philosophy. Now let's move on to synthesis. What exactly is better for America? First of all, stop sending the army to places where there is no American interest. Stop spending trillions on nation building in countries that don't want it. Stop measuring success by the number of countries with democratic choices. Military force is a tool of last resort, not the first response to every crisis. Now we need to focus on China as the main systemic challenge. They are not our enemy, but they are a systemic challenge that could become an enemy. Everything else is derived from this priority. Europe is important only to the extent that its losses will strengthen China. The Middle East is important only to the extent that its instability benefits Beijing. Africa is important only to the extent that there is a struggle for resources of the next technological cycle. The Pacific region is the main theater of American strategy in the 21st century. NATO. It needs to be reformed but not destroyed. Conditional reciprocity instead of unconditional commitments. Europe pays. Europe takes real responsibility for its own defense. And the U.S. maintains a nuclear umbrella but stops being a donor to Europe's socialist welfare state. Adam Smith was right 250 years ago, and he is right today. Open markets create interdependence that is more effective than any military alliances. Countries connected by trade have an incentive not to go to war. Instead of military bases, trade agreements. Instead of aircraft carriers, investment programs. This is not weakness. This is smart power. And probably the restoration of the American house as it was originally intended to be built. $38 trillion in debt. Destroyed infrastructure, a deindustrialized Midwest, a drug crisis killing more Americans than any war, and an educational system producing people who can't read or do math. This isn't a left-wing agenda or a right-wing one, it's pragmatism. You can't be a leader of the world while sitting in a broken house. Limited government isn't a slogan, it's architecture. The Constitution was created specifically to limit the power of the state over the citizen. Every departure from this principle, every new regulation, every new tax, every new agency, is a small step in the direction that, as I already mentioned, Hayek described as the road to serfdom. This doesn't mean anarchy. It means the state does what the private sector cannot do, protects the borders, ensures justice, maintains infrastructure, and stays away from everything else. Well, I would put it this way. This can also be handled by the private sector. But here you simply won't believe me, so for now, let's leave protection in the hands of the state. The moment of choice has come. We are living in a time that historians will probably study 100 years from now. The post-war order created in 1945 is simply collapsing before our eyes. NATO is cracking. The dollar is losing its status as the sole reserve currency. China is challenging American leadership not militarily, but economically, technologically, and institutionally. Russia is testing Western resolve in Europe, and Iran is doing the same in the Middle East. This is not the end of America. It's the end of one image of America and the beginning of another. The only question is, what will it be? The first option is that America continues trying to be the world's policeman, exhausting itself financially, politically, and morally, until its debt reaches the point of no return. The second option is that America turns inward, allowing the world to descend into chaos, which will eventually reach our shores anyway. The third option is the one I described today: strategic realism based on the principles of freedom. A strong military is a tool of deterrence, not expansion. Open trade is the main tool of influence. Reformed, fair alliances instead of unilateral subsidies. Focusing on China as the only systemic challenge. And restoring the American dream. John Quincy Adams wrote in 1821, "Wherever the banner of freedom is unfurled, the American heart will be with it. But we do not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy." I've already quoted part of it, and now I've decided to give you the whole quote. This is not isolationism, this is wisdom. A country that defends its interests, that knows its interests, defends them without hysteria, without crusades, without endless wars over other people's problems. Such a country is strong. America has created the most successful model of a free society in human history. The best thing it can do for the world is to remain that model, not impose it on anyone by force, not export it with bombs, but simply embody it. Because a free, prosperous, and self-confident America is a huge contribution to global freedom, a bigger, much bigger contribution to global freedom than any military operation. A lighthouse shines not because it goes out to sea, but because it stands in place and guides the way. That's all for today, ladies and gentlemen. It took a bit longer today, but I just wanted to share my thoughts on this topic, which is incredibly important right now. Goodbye until we meet again.